Thank you, everyone, for being interested in these topics, these themes. Two enormous themes, really. Climate crisis, which affects the entire world, and mythic imagination, which, from my point of view, also affects the entire world. And I'll try and say something about how they are connected. I'm not going to go into reports about what's happening in climate. I assume everybody knows something about it. I do want to say what an unusual time it is to be alive. That is to say, to be living when nature is rattling and culture is in many ways collapsing. It is a unique time. The world has gone through turmoil and great transitions before, but this has a unique quality in that involves both nature and culture at all levels of each of those. And so that's one reason why I think it has to be seen with different eyes. That is to say, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And so I know it's common in the modern world to think in terms of logic and science that we see objectively, but we don't. We see as we are. And so one of the messages of this time of radical change at so many levels is that we have to see it differently. We have to see it as if with different eyes, what I call the eyes of the soul. And so the first thing I want to do in terms of the mythic imagination side of things is to read a poem. So myth includes imagination, and imagination includes poetry and all of the arts. And I'll come back to that at some point. But this is a part of a poem by Theodore Roethke. And part of the work of poetry, and really the work of the arts, is to be visionary and at times to be oracular, to speak as an oracle. And this is one of those poems that speaks as an oracle long before the urgency of the climate crisis became so clear. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I'm going to pause for a minute because it's important, I think, to realize we are in the dark times. That's one way to understand what's happening. And we have to, as if, and as the poet is implying, learn to see in the dark. We have to find the light inside the darkness. In a dark time, the eye begins to see, and I meet my shadow in the deepening shades. I hear my echo in the echoing woods, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. And I live between the heron and the wren, between the beasts of the hill and the serpents of the den. And listen, what is madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? This day is on fire, and I know the purity of pure despair, my own shadow pinned against a sweating wall, and that place there amongst the rocks. Is it a cave or a winding path? In the dark times, the edge is what we have. So I'm using Roethke's poem to get us to that edge. And we're all on edge now because nature and culture are both on the edge, I would say, on the edge of transformation. And I noticed that the recent report from the International Council of Climate Scientists said that's what is needed now is not simple change, but complete transformation. Transformation, which means to move from one form of life to another, is a radical thing to experience personally, but we're being asked now to experience it collectively. It's, in a sense, the collective vision that has to see our way through this darkness. And I will say this several different ways. That is that the collective vision can only change by an accumulation of inspiration on an individual level of vision. There isn't going to be coming a new idea or a simple single way of looking at things. It's really the multiplicity of inspired vision that we need. And when that happens inside the souls of enough people, then you get collective change. At least that's the way I'm seeing it when I'm looking at it through the lens of myth. Repeat, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And so when the science reports, when we report on the climate crisis, says that we need transformation, that means we have to transform our own selves. And even though what we need is a change in the whole world, the only way we can contribute to the change is through the change inside us. And so the old idea is humans are the make-weights in the scale of time, and that change in the outer world begins as change in the depths of the inner world, in the soul of each person. So that this time of transformation is a transformation on the individual level, on the collective level, on the level of culture, on the level of nature. And if you really want to get into notions about transformation, it's transformation on a cosmic level. That is to say, all the levels of life are secretly connected, and the depth of soul in each person is secretly connected to all the levels of life. That's the only way we could understand that change is needed, and it's the only way I think that we can meaningfully contribute to the change. I'll keep coming back to these kind of ideas. And I think part of my job tonight is to say a bunch of ideas about big things. And it's not necessary to get it all. It's being recorded and you'll get a copy of it tomorrow, so you can always review it. And it's certainly not necessary to agree with it all. But I think the idea is to find something in this context, in this creative dynamic between the realm of nature and climate crisis and the realm of myth and the imagination of the soul, to get something from that space between in the context created by the two, in order to take back to daily life. Because one of the problems about living in the dark time is it's easy to become discouraged. And the urgency of events can become like a weight on the soul. And there's an old, Kierkegaard, I think it was, who said, the greatest cause of despair is not being who you are inside yourself. But I think nowadays we would have to add another great cause of despair, which is not knowing what's going to happen to the world, or not knowing how we should relate to the changes needed in the world. That seems to be causing despair as well. And so how does a person even work out of despair? My own sense is we can't completely avoid despair. The word despair from the French désespérer means to be without hope. And one of the tricks is not to be offended or hurt or afraid of being without hope, but how to learn how to feel hopeless and move through that as a kind of darkness. There are layers of hope. And I would say the deepest layer of hope is not simple, naive hope. It's actually imagination. Imagination is at the root of what makes us hopeful. And so when we become hopeless, really the idea is to go deeper and find the roots of hope, which exist, in my understanding, in the depths of our imagination. And our imagination is secretly connected to the soul of the world, which is another of the ideas in mythic imagination, which is that each soul is secretly connected to what used to be called anima mundi, or the soul of the world. And one of the reasons we can feel so bereft about the condition of the earth and the planet, as people call it, is because we are secretly connected to it and we can feel it. And so, the first problem is people don't feel what's happening in the world and they continue to contribute to the damage in the world. The second problem is you begin to feel what's happening in the world, and now you feel this great tension and this great weight that comes with the period of transformation. And so part of our job is to learn how to accept, handle, and not get trapped or paralyzed by the weight of what's happening. And so that weight can appear as the fatigue with climate crisis, which happens to individual people, but it also happens to the people working on climate crisis. I'll come back to that. So in terms of how to see, in terms of ways to see, which really means elements and aspects of vision, the ancient Greeks, who often divided things in two in order to see each part more clearly, had two major ways of seeing. One was called logos and the other was called mythos. Logos is the word from which we get logic, and it relates to reason and linear thinking. It relates to facts. It relates to things that are, what would you call them, literal, that things that are concrete. And linear time and all those things fit into logos. And then whatever doesn't fit into logos in their way of thinking was in mythos. In other words, myth is not something fanciful and disconnected from life. It's the other way of seeing life. It's the other way of accounting for what happens in the world. And so the side of things that they saw as mythos included feelings, it included emotions, it included imagination, it included inspiration, it included all the things that are mysterious. Mystery rather than history, which would be over in logos. And so it's as if we have lost an essential basic way of seeing the world. And now with all of the crisis happening, that way of seeing, which has feeling in it, which has essential sense of relationship and interconnectedness in it, which has essentially imagination in it, and also a capacity for inspiration, even in the darkness in it, that becomes, I think, way more important. And so it has to be added to our way of seeing the world, or we have to open those inner eyes of the soul, I like that term, which give us imagination in the midst of confusion, and inner light or inner capacity in the midst of darkness. That's one of the first ideas that I'm interested in. That there is an exaggeration of reason and logic in the modern worldview. We don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And one of the ways that collectively the world is seen in modern Western culture is through the lens of logos. And that becomes positivistic science and all kinds of other things. It becomes ideology also. And there's this other way of seeing that's closer to nature. Nature doesn't fall into logos, it falls into mythos. In West Africa, for instance, nature is described as spirit with a green garment on. That's mythic talk. That's mythic connection. And so if we're going to reconnect culture to nature, we're going to have to see it as already secretly connected, and we're going to have to see it as outside, below, and beyond the bounds of logic. So I think that's part of the challenge that we're given in this necessity for transforming. It's not as if we have to find something completely new. It is as if we have lost essential things. And one of the essential things, as far as I'm concerned, is mythos, mythic imagination, but also the realm of story. One way you can describe myth is stories that are not true on the surface, but that reveal the deeper truths once you're inside the story. So another thing from the mythic imagination point of view is a poet once saying, this world is not made out of atoms. That would be logic, science, something you could study in a laboratory. This world is made out of stories. And so one of the problems now is people think they are in different stories, absolutely in different stories, and can't see and don't even necessarily want to understand the other person's story. That means we've fallen out of the stories that could hold us together. And that means we have to find our way back to a storied sense of the earth and a storied sense of the cosmos. So But one other thing that happens, the mythic world is usually about three things. And so there is a third way of seeing, in a sense, which we call psychology. And so psychology is like a world between the world of logos, the literal world, which is, you could also call the world of one, facts, moments seen as one thing at a time, discrete, objective things, the world of that, the world of one, the world of also becomes one way of seeing things. It also becomes the world of black and white, in that sense of one way, or seeing with one eye. And then psychology becomes the world of two, the facts and how I feel about them. And right now, that psychological world, which is a bridge world between mythos, logos and mythos, is really important, because people are seeing things so differently that there has to be an increase of understanding of psychology in order to bring people back together again. Psychology is the world of two, the fact and how I feel about it, the inner and the outer, the self and the other. And so one of the ways of seeing better what's going on is a deepening of our understanding of psychology. And to me, it happens all the time. Like when it comes to the pandemic, which is the second, I would say, big crisis that's affecting everyone on planet Earth. The idea starts with follow the science. It's a good idea. The science studies the virus, follow the science. But as soon as you follow the science in this modern contemporary world where the transitions and transformations are happening, whether we know it or not, and whether we agree with it or not, everything changes so fast that the science changes fast. And so people following the science have to really keep up, and some people don't want to. And so again, you have people separating and splitting. And so the science can't be the simple answer. I would also say, in order for ideas and knowledge found in the scientific logos realm to be communicated meaningfully to people who don't necessarily live in those realms, then some greater sense of storytelling and ways of communicating that invite people into the story, as opposed to simply delivering facts. So, for instance, I read a lot of climate reports, and sometimes I feel so heavy at the end that it reminds me of the part in the Bible where the people are feeding the hungry, but they have no bread to give them, so they're feeding them stones. And sometimes I feel like an overload of factual information from the realm of logos and science can be like trying to digest stones, and it just stops the process, and it leads to what some people call climate fatigue, getting worn out and weighed down and overwhelmed by the onslaught of information and facts. Not that they aren't necessarily important, but how they are delivered and how they are digested becomes, I think, the work of psychology, and ultimately also the work of mythology and story. How do these facts fit into a story that allow us to see the world differently and see the world continuing? Because one of the problems is that people see, by studying facts, by accumulating factual information, many people begin to see the world ending. And that has become a common thing. Most views of the world now are fatalistic. And I have to say, one of the troubles I have with that is young people are always growing up into the atmosphere of the culture in which they live, and they have very little defense against that atmosphere. Rebelling is just an indication of how little defense they have. In other words, children and young people are absorbing the atmosphere in terms of climate crisis, the atmosphere in terms of cultural crisis, and the atmosphere in terms of the psychological crisis of all the adults around them. And that is a really heavy thing to think about. And it also drops into the area of How do we find stories to tell younger people about the world, about the cosmos, about transformation, about the capacity of things to change and kind of revive? Do we know those stories? Do we know how to communicate them? And can we do them in all honesty? So that's seems to me we need all three ways of thinking and perceiving the world right now. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is lay out territories that are viewpoints or ways of seeing what's going on so that we're not seeing it with a single eye. The psychological viewpoint doubles everything and makes things in a way more possible. For instance, the troubles in the world right now when it comes to disparity, when it comes to injustice, when it comes to pandemics, when it comes to climate, are just at times overwhelming, and people fall into despair. And one of the psychological problems, I would say, is I have been, and I think most of us have been educated to think that sorrow and despair and things like that are things we shouldn't have. And yet, from the view of psychology, they're unavoidable. And if we understand the psychology of the emotions, they're things that can move through us as we move through them, and we don't have to be trapped in them if we're not afraid of them, and we have a greater sense of learning the motions and the capacities of our own souls. And then when you get to the world of myth, like in Greek myth, they used to have Hades. Hades was the name of the underworld. And the understanding was that people fall into the underworld all the time. Soon as you hear a new report on ice caps melting, boom, you're going into the underworld. And so they had an imagination that there was a world below the world that had in it all the so-called negative emotions, and you could fall into it in a minute. But they also understood that in that underworld, which was actually in the earth, is the place where wisdom and hidden treasures exist. And so by learning how to descend with the heavy emotions, a person could wind up in the place where hidden things could be found and recovered. And the old idea was, if you descend on sorrow, you rise on joy. And so the idea, why would you rise on joy? Joy is part of the central energy of the earth itself. And so the mythological understanding was you could descend into heavy, dark places. The original therapists, they called them, the word comes from Greek, ancient Greece, they lived in caves. Why? Because Earth had its own wisdom, and you could get closer to the wisdom of Earth by descending into caves or by following the emotions down. I'm just trying to add a psychological depth, but also a mythological turn to something that most of us are experiencing when we're in a time of radical change like this. The things that throw us off our feet, the things that can pitch us into uncertainty, the things that can drop us into deep, heavy feelings come more often. And both psychology and mythology have ways of understanding how to accept that rather than simply be thinking something is wrong. And as long as I'm saying that, I want to add one of the psychological ideas, which is that a person can become anxious at any time. We all know anxiety because we're anticipating a test that's coming up or something that is challenging. But now what's happening, because whether people are conscious and acknowledge it or not, because the entire human race, all of humanity, is aware at some level of climate crisis and all the other changes going on, there is an intensification of collective anxiety, collective fear, and even collective grief. And so it doesn't even have to be strictly personal. We hear some story of refugees in trouble there, of the earthquake hitting in Haiti, and a part of us feels it more deeply because collectively the anxiety, the fear, the anguish, and the grief has already been triggered. And so that makes having a psychological capacity to handle emotions, and I think also a mythical imagination that can see and find ways through the troubling elements and the darkness of some of the heavier emotions. So, 3 different ways of seeing the world. Each of them has value, but if we don't know that there's actually 3 of them, we can wind up with the single-eyed view of things, and that's what causes the polarization and keeps people separate. If you get the people who don't agree on anything at all into a kind of a vessel of change, where it's about deep emotions and everybody has pain and everybody has loss, all of a sudden those more or less surface ideological oppositions can be melted down to a more human condition. And if people can imagine that they're in the same story, then ground can be found that is imaginal ground and psychological ground, emotional ground, and other kinds of territory where people can meet and they don't have to agree. They just have to agree that they're present and struggling at a hard time in the world. So that makes me think of a story. So this is a story I've told many times, and I'm telling it tonight, and I'm a little bit apologizing to the main character in the story because it's the best story I have found to explain what we're in, what transformation means, and what's happening on the various levels of life, from the human to the level of the planet and to the level of the energies even beyond the planet. And so this is a story, I'm just going to give the summary of it, that I've found in a number of different Native tribes in America. They each have different versions of it. There usually are many versions of a story. Rarely I don't know if you can find a story that has only one version. The word version means that there's more, ways that it's being told. And so I call it the old cave woman. And it goes like this. The ancient people say that right near where we are, there's a cave, and that the knowledge that everybody is looking for and needs at this time can be found in that cave, and yet people so rarely find it. They say that if you find that cave, inside it you will see an old woman, and she's weaving a garment, and she'd been weaving it for a long time, and it's the most beautiful garment that anyone has ever seen. And she's been weaving to the point to where she's doing the hem and the trim on the garment, and she wants it to be especially beautiful. And so she's making that out of porcupine quills. And in order to weave in the porcupine quills, she has to bite down on them. And she's been biting down on quills for so long that she's worn her teeth down to the gums. But still, she keeps biting on the quills and weaving them into the garment, except for when she has to stop and go to the back of the cave. And in the back of the cave, there is a fire. And some people say it's the most ancient thing on this earth, that fire that may come from the center of the earth. And hanging above that fire, there's a cauldron. And in the cauldron are all the seeds of all the plants and all the grains and all the flowers and all the forests. The seeds that grow all the living things are in that cauldron. And if the old woman doesn't go back and stir the cauldron once in a while, then all the seeds will burn up, and we won't have forests, and we won't have flowers, and we won't have plants, and we won't have grains. And so the old woman, tired from all the work she's been doing, slowly moves to the back of the cave to stir the cauldron of seeds. And at that point, the black dog goes over to where she has laid down the beautiful weaving that she has been working on for so long. And the black dog sees a loose thread and begins to pull on the thread and keeps pulling until the entire weaving is unwoven and now lays in a chaotic mess on the floor. And then the old woman comes back and sees all of her creative effort turned into nothing but chaos. And she pauses for a minute. And she sits down. And after a while, she sees a loose thread and she picks that thread up. And as soon as she picks up that thread, she has another vision of a garment that's even more beautiful than the one she had been working on for so long. And she begins to weave again the most beautiful garment anyone has ever seen. And when the old people tell the story, and it's the old people that tell it, and they tell the story when everything seems to be falling apart and turning into chaos, when they tell the story, they say, don't be angry at the black dog. Be thankful for that which unravels everything, because it eventually leads to the reweaving of everything. And they also say, that old woman isn't a simple woman. That old woman is the old woman who weaves the whole world. And the garment that's being referred to is the world itself, which is always being rewoven. We're just usually not aware of it. And the old people also say, when things get dark and uncertain and everything feels chaotic, each person's job is to find the thread, the loose thread that's waiting for them to pick it up, because although we are not that old woman, we all can help reweave the world. So that's the story. It's a very brief, what I call a folk myth, but it tells the story of the whole thing. And in an interesting way, it describes the dynamic of the earth, the dynamic of nature, and the dynamic of the cosmos, which is to say, creation, sustaining energy that keeps things going, and then the unraveling, the collapse, the chaos that causes everything to fall apart and go into darkness, from which the weaving starts again. This is the old understanding of the world, that the cosmos is regenerative, just the way a forest, in a great forest, the big trees fall down and they begin to rot down into the earth, and from the collapse of those trees comes the next generation of trees in the forest. It's the move of nature, but it's secretly the move of human culture too. It's just that it's been forgotten, just as the connection from culture to nature has been forgotten. And the stories, to me, seem to be trying to remind us, if we're going to help reweave things together again, we're going to have to understand that regeneration is an essential movement in nature, but also in culture, and also in the cosmos in general. So in terms of hope, but I'm trying to turn simple hope into deep imagination. The hope from this mythological perspective is tied to the idea of understanding and accepting the necessity for transformation. And that involves seeing the world differently. Notice the old woman in the story. She sees the whole world new again. The elders that tell the story are saying that garment isn't a simple cloak. It's the garment of the world. Everything is woven together. And when it falls apart, which it inevitably does, what is needed is a vision for weaving it all back together again. So that says to me, we're in this very unusual time where we are being challenged and invited to be part of the reweaving of the world. It's not a matter of simply saving the earth. It's partially a matter of allowing the earth to show us how to help weave together with it. And so the old woman is this, it's not accidental that it's an old woman in the cave, it's the old wise woman. But it's also showing this element where the feminine has always been the energy that weaves, that secretly connects one thing to another. And so the old woman in the cave is Mother Earth. And that's significant also. Many, many cultures imagine the earth as mother. And so what does that mean? Well, in some cultures, it means that the earth element is the element of generosity, of nurturing, also the element of keeping in touch. We're all walking on the earth, and I know people are all dissociated and opposed and polarizes, but our feet are all on the same earth. We're walking on the same earth all the time, and the earth is secretly keeping us connected, even though most people can't see or feel it. And so it's not an accident that the key person in this drama of change and transformation is a feminine figure that is inside a cave, inside the earth, as if the story is trying to say there's earth wisdom that is nearby, that's accessible, and that we're going to need if we're going to contribute to the weaving of another world and not simply contribute to the collapse of this one. And so the old woman, mythologically, she's Sophia. In the old stories, Sophia was the first one to weave the world. And interestingly enough, unlike some other deities, after the weaving occurred, Sophia didn't depart, but decided to stay in the world. And so that energy that made the world remains in the world. And this is one of the ways of seeing that I think is required. When you see the practices from ancient India, for instance, coming so strongly into the Western world, one way to understand that is that ancient world of the East imagined these cycles where the world comes to an end and then starts again. As a matter of fact, the word Orient means aimed at the rising sun. And the word Occident, which is the word for the West, means looking at the falling down sun. So that the West needs to learn from stories in the East that, yes, the sun goes down and everything goes dark, and then it comes back again. So there's a reorientation of perspective, especially in the Western world. And in the story, there's a reorientation by accepting the collapse and the chaos, the disorder that now is so prevalent in life, accepting it and then watching until the opportunity is there to find a thread and begin contributing to the weaving. So, another way to look at this, I want to add one more viewpoint, is going back to the science reports, the latest ones, which are emphatically saying humans have in a major way contributed to the climate crisis. They're trying to get people to understand that is the case. The meaningful part of that in terms of, say, psychology, is that if we have contributed to the crisis, we must have some capacity to contribute to the healing and the regenerating of life. And that's kind of what the story says also, that we are living at this point, which is where the old woman is seeing the chaos, the collapse, the disorder. And then she's also seeing the vision that gives imagination, a capacity to be creative, inspiration, and a way of engaging and remaking that which has fallen apart. And so I keep coming back to this story because it so clearly emphasizes where we are. And if a person can imagine that place in the story where the old woman stops to realize what has happened, then that's the place that we're in. And going back to the ideas of despair and all, when a person falls into despair, it's as if they're pulled into the unraveled part of the garment in the cave. But we don't have to stay there. In other words, the despair comes from thinking there's no way out of that chaos, and the way out is to connect somehow through the thread of one's life into the world, and then that brings purpose, inspiration, a sense of capacity, and the next thing, we're moving in a way that's meaningful. And when a human being changes their life, it changes the people around them to some degree, and if enough people change their lives, then it changes the collective, and the next thing you have culture moving back into a dynamic and creative connection to nature. So I'll stop there. What I'm going to do is do these kind of descriptions and, stories, and then go to questions. And I see there's a bunch of questions. I suffer from climate fatigue and climate grief. And here the climate scientists who have been sounding the alarm now for decades have their own fatigue. How do we stay involved but not fall into despair? Well, the answer is there in the story. We have to find our own thread. So the issue now, I'm going to repeat, I don't think there's a quick fix coming. I don't think there's going to be a collective idea or a new religion or a de facto description that everybody's going to say, that's it, we're going there. I think what's happened already is that the crises and the troubles are at all layers of nature and all layers of culture, that so many things need attention, care, support, and healing, that it requires a multitude of people. And following the story, each person allowing themselves to be pulled into the area where they can actually contribute, which makes sense, where their inner nature connects them either to nature or a part of culture. Both things have to be healed and reimagined at the same time, because they're both reflections of the same thing. That's the old understanding. That's the two garments also. They used to say in West Africa, nature is spirit with a green garment on, culture is spirit with a multicolored robe on. The two garments are unraveling at the same time because they need to be re-woven back together. And so the first thing is, yes, we have to allow that fall into despair sometimes, but understand underneath despair is something deeper, something that's trying to awaken, like an old story trying to get remembered again, old energies, old elements of imagination trying to re-enter the world through us. One of the old stories is that oh God, this is tricky too, because a lot of people think that the concrete, literal world is the only world, but every culture until modern culture understood there's an other world right next to this world, the world of imagination, the world where creation began and where it continues. And the energy of this other world, which is in a sense eternal and never comes to an end, is trying to enter this world all the time, and it can only enter through the people that are alive. And so if we are in that position and we're open to allow the energy of creation to come in through us in small and bigger ways, then we become agents of the creation trying to happen as part of the transformation from one version and one view of the world to the next. Even if we do find our thread and our calling to reweave the garment of destiny, how can we really feel that the new garment will be anything close to what we are losing? Wow, it's an interesting question. So the implication there is that the loss has to be greater than what comes next. And I think, mythologically, that doesn't make a lot of sense, really. In other words, creation is something ongoing according to all the old myths. And what's created is the whole world over again. So it's not a matter of which one is better. It's just like a different garment, a different vision. It's still going to have, maybe you're referring to the idea that nature might have some diminished aspects for a while, and culture might struggle to gather its full vitality for a while. In that sense, yes. But in the sense of imagination and the idea that creation is an ongoing thing, not something in the past, it's not, the key thing isn't to measure what's found against what is lost. The key thing, as a person grows older, they lose vitality. But in the old understanding, when people grew older, they had a chance to grow wiser. And so even though there was a loss of youthful vitality, there could be a gain of depth of wisdom. So I would look at it more like that. The old woman, she's my guide. And in the story, she sees an even better vision. And maybe every vision of creation is better at first. I don't know. But I'm going to take our guidance on that. I trouble over what kind of world young people now have to enter and how all these crises affect their dreams and aspirations. I'm with you on that. It's one of the saddest things in the world. I already mentioned it. Young people can't defend themselves against the atmosphere. I mean, the poison atmosphere of climate crisis, but also the poison in the cultural atmosphere. I mean, they see, they feel the internet, all the stories, the information. They're being, bombarded with the chaos and the confusion and the anguish and the death and the losses. And so it becomes the job of those of us that are older to somehow be able to frame to them that these ideas about transformation and change. Another way to understand it, we're at the end of an era. And what that means in a sense is the end of a worldview. Like the Enlightenment was part of the view of the world in the Western world for a long time, the modern world. And now we're in the Endowment, like in the cave. The light has diminished and the dark, now we have to learn the braille of creating in darkness. So here's something I want to say about the young people. Another old idea is that there's two arcs of life. And the first arc of life is when you grow up. You go from being an infant to a child, you go through the developmental stages, and you become essentially like a young person, an adolescent, a teenager, whatever you want to call it. That's the arc of growing up. And on that arc, from that arc, you enter the world, and as they used to say, you get a life. But the second arc was the arc of awakening from inside, the arc of awakening to a meaningful calling in life, the arc of awakening to the fact that each life already has some purpose woven into it. And that has the elements of deep reflection and awakening from within and growing some soul and finding soulful connections to the world. And one way I'm looking at it now is young people might need to get to the second arc sooner. When you have now the crisis in education that's caused by COVID, for instance, so that it's not clear if the schools can function and all that kind of stuff, rather than simply be in the lament for the loss of structured schooling, there also is an opportunity there to bring stories back in and any other way that can help young people see the second arc of life or feel some sense that they are on a vision quest that is necessary because of the condition of the world. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'm saying that we can't abandon youth just because we're not sure what to tell them. And again, I think we have to see it slightly differently. Like the young people now might have to get a connection to their own inner thread, their own inborn genius, and from there feel connected to the world. And that may be important, more important in some ways than restructuring, the typical outward aimed educational process. A lot of parents, I wind up talking to parents and to teachers, and parents will say, my children think the world's going to come to end, and they're saying, why should we even bother? And I think as parents, as teachers, as adults, as would-be mentors and potential elders, we have to be able to say, well, it doesn't work like that. Actually, we're not even here to have a career. We're here to have a calling. And in order to say that in a meaningful way, a person has to have some sense of their own experience. So that leads to saying that maybe all of us need to be more on the second arc than on the first arc. And I'll come back to that in the next, section of just laying out stuff. Earth in Hindu culture is known as Bhudevi. Bhu is ground, Devi is goddess. And body is where Kundalini Shakti resides. What are the relations of feminine consciousness, namely earth and body, with current circumstances? So thank you. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. This Native American story could come from India. Ancient Indian myths will talk about those three dynamics of creation, sustaining, and then destruction, and then creation again. That little story has some of the major myths of the world in it. And as I said, it's not an accident that it's an old wise woman in the cave. Um, the earth has often been connected to the sense of the feminine, and part of what's happened in the development of modern culture, logos culture, masculine dominated, even the heroic myths and the idea of heroic energy, all of those have tended to be um, diminishing or anti-feminine, and that means anti-earth. I mean, the earth has been exploited rather than seen as the source of nurturance and generosity, and even healing. And so when I say seeing with different eyes, we have to be able to go back and see with the eyes that people used to see when they understood Bhudevi, that the goddess was present in the earth, like Sophia. That's a Western myth that's very similar to the Eastern ideas, that the eternal and the divine is here in the earth, that it is not in a heaven somewhere else, it's actually here, that the divine energies are here on earth. And as a matter of fact, some of the history of religion and the ideas, especially in monotheistic systems, where they think the divine is off somewhere, has caused people to devalue the earth. This is not that time. We're in the time now where we have to reimagine the sacredness of the earth and find our way back there, and that requires reimagining the sacredness of the feminine. If we have to weave nature and culture together, we also have to reweave the feminine with the masculine together. And in stories, when you see what's missing, the beginning of a story will often show what's missing. And when you see what's missing in the beginning of a story, it tells you what is trying to be envisioned and reimagined throughout the story. And so we can make a list of things that are missing in the modern story of the world, which would have to include nature for the most part, earth for the greater part, but also the feminine, but also the orphans and the others and the rejected. All of the things that are missing are the things that are going to have to be reimagined and brought back in to make the next world, because exclusiveness is an aspect of this world, just as separation has become a dominant aspect of this world, division. So the next world, we don't have to have a precise vision of it. The next world's going to have unity rather than division, inclusiveness rather than exclusiveness, and enough the feminine that has been excluded for centuries in many parts of the world. You can see by the exclusion what the next vision should be about. So yes, thank you for that. So I should say also, so what's happening is not simply that humans are changing the world, that's part of it, but the world itself is changing. That is to say, the archetypes that are moving in the world are changing. The world itself is changing. Whatever has caused it, enough has happened that the world is now in its own motion changing. And so one way to think about that, both psychologically and mythologically, is that the archetypes are changing. And so two of the key archetypes right now, I think, one is the archetype of apocalypsis, which is in the story as the unraveling, the collapse, the chaos, which is happening everywhere. But the corresponding one shown in the story also is the archetype of creation. And so apocalypse doesn't mean the fiery end of the world. Apocalypse means the collapse of things that eventually leads to the recreation of things. Archetypes have aims and intentions, and the archetype of apocalypse is to go from collapse to renewal. The Greek word is apocalypse leads to apocastasis, which is the remaking of the world with elements included that were missing when it fell apart. And so on one hand, we're in this archetypal dynamic of collapse renewal, which in a strange way happens at the same time, not necessarily sequentially. And at another level, we're being called into the archetype of creation. In other words, we are being asked, the archetype of creation, the dynamic there is something is brought into the world that didn't exist. All of the arts are about bringing something in that didn't exist. And we are being asked and invited to, in a sense, tap in to the archetype of the creator and creation. In other words, in the old way of looking at things, each soul is unique and each soul has a capacity to create something. And so in the modern way of looking at things, you have people that are really talented and they do the creating and other people get a job. But the real understanding of the soul is everybody has something, some creative potential. And the archetype of creation exists in everybody. And so the thread that's mentioned in the story, which becomes the thread of the individual soul, which is connected to the genius. The word genius means the spirit that's already in you when you're born. And that inner genius is a connection, a unique connection to the archetype of creation. And so in this archetypal way of looking at things, where in the midst of the collapse leading to renewal archetype, and the renewal part of it is the awakening of creative energy deep in the soul of each person. That's the potential. And the more people that awaken to this capacity inside, the more the collective changes, and it doesn't have to have all kinds of agreements. It changes by virtue of mutual creative activity, and some people are pulled into aspects of nature where they can contribute the most, and other people are pulled into healing levels of culture where they can contribute the most, and that's the way that it transforms. So I want to say a little bit more about that. So the dynamic of transformation, in a sense, is connected to the process of initiation. So one way that I think about it is that we are now in a collective rite of passage. Like it or not, we are as collective humanity, because everybody now understands that through the internet is one way people understand it, everyone's connected, but that opens up to a deeper sense of connectivity where everybody has always been connected. Not only that, we're not just connected to each other, we're connected to the animals and the forests. That deep interconnectivity, which is suggested by the weaving of the old woman in the cave, is now something that's pretty clear to a whole lot of people. And so the transformation could be seen as a collective rite of passage. It's true that most ideas about the future, the most common ideas about the future now, are fatalistic. And the fatalism that you can find in science, you can find it in social situations, and you can find it even in religious beliefs, can be connected to nihilism, which means thinking it's all nothing and it all amounts to nothing, and in the end nothing will happen, it all be reduced to nothing. That's part of the darkness. That's part of brushing up against collapse and chaos. Chaos means loss of order, but it also means the abyss, and that's the deep darkness. And so we can't help it now. We're brushing up against the deep darkness. But there's no need to fall all the way into nihilism. The idea is that this brushing or descent and touching the darkness, which everybody is feeling through the climate crisis, but also through the coronavirus, is part of the way. And that the rest of it is this finding ways to participate in recreation as a dynamic of nature and as an artful necessity of culture. So in this idea of collective rite of passage, one of the understandings is there's no way to go forward, to really be going forward, without letting go of forms that are no longer full of life. And so one of the things that is holding everyone back, I think, is the idea that we can't let go. I mean, but strangely enough, most of the institutions now are rattling and not working, and some of them we're going to have to let go of, at least for a while. And so that leads me to this idea that we're on this threshold of change. And the threshold right now, I think, is big. I think it includes everybody. The world as we knew it is already gone. The people that think you can reclaim it are just mistaken, or they're backwards on the threshold, looking back. Looking forward from the threshold is a challenge of its own, but looking back is like a waste of understanding, because everyone is caught up in this transformation, and maybe it's natural to feel a pull. We wish we were in simpler times, but we are not. We are in the complexities of these times, and we're on the threshold of change. And so I want to say some things about maybe how that works. So rite of passage and initiation are two ways of talking about the radical transformation that can happen individually, and it can happen collectively as well. It happens individually all the time, even though it's not clearly understood in modern culture. To have it be happening collectively is really unusual. That it's not just a community or just a belief group or a nation, but it's really humanity that's trying to transform. That's very rare, and it's its own kind of challenge. So I want to just lay out the steps of rite of passage or initiation, and suggest how they depict the dynamic and the nature of transformation. Going back to the idea that the climate reports are saying it's not just evolution or progress that are needed now, it's transformation. Science, in a sense, stepping closer to mythos and stepping nearer to the idea of rite of passage or initiation and initiatory change. In other words, one way to think of ourselves, how we can negotiate all that's going on, is to imagine that we're each initiates, not heroes about to fix everything, but initiates learning to walk in the darkness, learning to walk in the darkness in order to find a new way of seeing. And so rites of passage has these three steps. And so the first step is separation. And it seems to me that has already happened. It's happened in the sense that the old world view doesn't hold anymore. The world as we knew it is already gone. It's happening in the separations and divisions that are occurring among people, but it's happening also in the separations that are occurring in ecological systems. And so there's a lot of division and separation going on, and that can be understood both psychologically and mythologically as the first step of a rite of passage or initiatory change. The other elements that usually come along with that separation are descent, darkness, and some sense of death. Now, this is a heavy thing, but these are heavy times. And one difference between the modern world and, let's say, education and learning and the ancient world is, in the ancient world, young people would be introduced to death at this time that we call adolescence or teenage or youth. They would be literally introduced to the idea that the world is a mystery that is made of life, death, and renewal, or life, birth, and rebirth. That was the mystery. That is the mystery. And it used to be taught to young people. And so, in a way, when I'm thinking about young people, how do we, again, help them orient by saying this idea of descent and darkness, loss and confusion is a kind of mini death that is intended to lead to great change and a greater life. I think that's the education that's necessary for the young people and for most of us that are older as well. So that's the first step. And it seems to me we keep making that step in climate crisis and COVID, the pandemic is a real, literal kind of experience of separation, social distancing, knowing people who are sick and dying, death counts being told in public, in reporting all the time, whereas they were covered up previously. It's like death trying to enter the world again. And death was considered the beginning of philosophy, by the way. And so it's as if maybe a different philosophy of life is trying to be born from the presence of death. That's initiatory thinking. The second phase or step of an initiation is the transition, which in a way we're also in. We're already on our way. We're on this threshold. We don't know where we're going. But in a sense, we can grasp the fact that something has already been lost and it's already gone. And that stage is sometimes called liminality, being on the limit, at the bottom of the threshold, not in the new world yet, but out of the old one. And so we're invited to learn about this betwixt and between sense of life. The middle ground of initiation, the liminality, is also connected to what's called the creative middle of life. Between one thing and another is where all the dynamic changes occur, like the moment when the old woman in the cave stops and looks at the chaos and hasn't yet seen the next vision of her weaving. That's the liminal space. And the reason I think it becomes important to consider it is in the liminal space, in the betwixt and between, in the phase after some things have died, but the regeneration hasn't occurred yet. People have to learn to live and see and be in that betwixt and between space. If we can't tolerate that kind of a stage of unknowing. So this is a real challenge to the logos world. It's a real challenge to the world that most of us are used to, where, every organization has a strategic plan. Well, try to have a strategic plan now. The strategic plans are being blown up day after day. It just happened in Kabul, in Afghanistan. It's happening all over. It's happening in schools because the variant of COVID is back. I'm trying to say that the experiences we're having in the world are educational on their own, and they're trying to educate us into this understanding of transformation, uncertainty, and liminality. It makes me think of a scene in a story. This happens to be another Native American story. And this story is the story of how healing began. That's the title of the story. And it's about the first people on Earth. And what happens is they finally settle in some place on Earth, and then some people are sick and are losing life, and no one even knows what sickness is, and therefore no one knows what healing is, and death hasn't even occurred yet. And so no one knows what's going on, and everybody's in this radical uncertainty and not knowing what to do. And four of the first people, one evening go out and stand as the earth gets darker and the light withdraws from the earth, and they stand and look into the darkness. And when they do that, the one who made the earth, that's what it's called in the story, the one who made the earth speaks to them and says, for every sickness there's a cure. For every illness there's an antidote. For every trouble there's a solution. That's the way it is on earth. And so now they had knowledge found from the darkness. And it was knowledge combined with healing, as if to say the right knowledge in a situation is also an aspect of healing. And so then they go back, but each night they go out and stand and look into the darkness as if they have found their practice of how to live in uncertainty and how to live in liminality and how to live on the threshold when things are just being learned. And then night after night, each one of them gets a revelation. They each get some knowledge, and they each get a song in this case. And then they come back in, having been advised by the one who made the world that they have to share those songs and bring everybody together and give them the knowledge they got from darkness. So it comes to my mind because I think that's us, that we are there again. We're there in the darkness. We're there in the place of not knowing. And this is a huge challenge to the kind of world where everybody had plans and everybody at least acted as if we all know what we're doing. And now we don't. And so what I'm trying to say is this is not unnatural. It actually is kind of natural to find light, wisdom, knowledge in the darkness. And it's also mythologically a genuine story. And so that we aren't lost, we're just in the darkness the way those first people were. We're returning to a place where we have to learn how to learn again. And we have to learn from the immediacy of the world, not necessarily from formulas and ideologies that are being handed down that can't quite measure up to the weight and the intensity of what we're experiencing. So to me, this is deeply encouraging and challenging, yes, but it says there's a braille of understanding that can be learned by not knowing. In Zen Buddhist practice, it's called Shoshin, or beginner's mind. So we have to be now like the initiates, like those at the beginning, willing to stand in uncertainty, willing to acknowledge not knowing. And that strangely puts us closer to ideas and images that are trying, and inspirations that are trying to enter the world. That's what happened to those people in the story when they first stood in darkness. So that's the middle ground. That's the liminal place. That's the place where knowledge enters through darkness. And then that leads to the third step of initiation, which is a return to community, a return to, the Latin word is communitas, a return to a place where people recognize each other's suffering and each other's struggles and each other's paths of awakening and losing. And then people come back together, and out of the struggle of their lives, make a community again. So that says to me that we're also being invited and challenged to find ways to make communities that are not trying to avoid loss and struggle and pain, but communities that understand that. It also suggests to me that we're really in this passage to re-find humanity again, right? I mean, the world is inhumane in many ways at this time, and it's as if the pain of that is, in some sense, provoking us to find the depths of inclusive humanity again. That would be part of the rite of passage or the initiatory path. Another way to talk about that, I think, would be to say that we're trying to find the sacredness of human community again. If we all could be together in a space, that's difficult right now, but we can be practicing for getting there. That's part of our in-between transitional step. But when people are in a place together and it becomes about sharing in honest ways, this has been the work of Mosaic for 35 years. And when that sharing becomes honest and people are only there to express pain and loss in order to seek some kind of healing, something completely transformative can occur. And people do not judge each other based on appearance. They actually relate to each other based on experience of loss, experience of pain. And that, I think, is what we're intended to do with the pain that we're all feeling, is use it to bring us together like the people of those first people who went out with the pain of everybody and got knowledge in the darkness and used it to bring everyone back together. I think we're invited, because of all the loss all around us, we're being invited to find ways to come back together again, not, as some people say, go back to normal. Normal doesn't exist, and if it did, who wants to be there? But go back to deeply human community, the Latin word communitas. And in a sense, what communitas means, something so deep and meaningful is felt that everybody forgets their differences and relates to the interconnected. It's through the depth of the human soul. That is one way to kind of transform the pain of living now into the birth of a deeper sense of individual soul and the soul of humanity being revived. So I'll stop there because I see there's more questions coming. Would you speak to transforming our Western view of human separateness from nature to one of interdependence and entanglement in a web of life and living? So I've been suggesting that old idea that there's two garments. So if you take it from this African point of view, spirit is present throughout the world. Or if you go to the Australian Aboriginal term, they have a term called yoro. And it means everything in the world alive and speaking to you, are you hearing? So, and if you take the idea of a collective rite of passage and borrow momentarily from the Aboriginal people in Australia, the indigenous people, they would call it walkabout. That we're on this non-strategically planned walkabout where we have the opportunity and the need to allow the world to talk to us. And when a person is open in that way, which you could also call being in touch with their soul, begins to become apparent that the human soul is connected to nature. The idea that nature and culture are separate is a fairly new idea in terms of the history of Earth, and it's not a very good idea. There's certain things you could learn from it, but it has turned out to be damaging. And so one of the ways, another way to speak about interconnectedness and interrelatedness is soulfulness. And so the old idea is the human soul is connected to the soul of the world, and the world is alive and it has its own soul. And so we're all have the opportunity to find our soulful connections to the world. I was mentioning some Native American stories, and in many Native American traditions, there was something called the second soul. And the second soul was a way of describing a person's innate connection to nature. So that some people would have a connection to a particular kind of bird, another person to a particular kind of tree, and so on. We are connected to nature. Human nature is nature. And so we have to discover this kind of depth of connection in ourselves if we're going to expect to find it with other people, and if we're going to expect to be contributing to nature and culture, reconnecting and reweaving. So I'm back to the idea then that if we can't transform the soul of the individual, we can't transform the culture. And so we're each on our own rite of passage pathway, but there are places where things interconnect. So I don't think there's any simple way to talk about interrelatedness and reconnection. I want to repeat the idea of communitas, the depth of living community found in the individual soul. And honestly, that can happen, and many people have had this experience with the world of nature. I mean, trees can be quite alive and present in all kinds of ways, as of course animals are. And Euro, that idea says nature, the elements of nature, the animals, the plants and all are speaking to us and often offering healing. So, given the briefness of the evening, I can't go into that. But human nature is not separate from nature. It is deeply connected to nature. And when we get to the depth of the human soul, we find those waiting connections. I'm wanting to find how to pick up the thread and begin weaving something back into creation, but I don't know how. Can you give advice on one thing I can start doing to figure out how I can help weave a loose thread? All right, so thank you. Thank you for the honesty. And it's not unusual not to know. I mean, people have been over adapting to the outer structures of culture for a long time. And it has almost been forgotten that everybody arrives in the world with an aim in their life, with purpose in their deep self trying to awaken, and with an aspect of each person's soul that's trying to, ready to, expecting to answer a call. And so when it doesn't happen, you have a whole lot of disappointed people who, if they allow themselves to stay in that condition, become resentful or become hollow. And so the real thing, as far as I'm concerned, is to awaken to the unique thread of one's life. And as soon as we have a connection to it, we actually have a road, an inroad into the world that has purpose, kind of evolving from within, but also has all kinds of inspiration becomes possible. And one of the great sadnesses of the world is that this is no longer common. So the actual answer, I think I have to say, is this. It isn't a matter of simply picking up a thread. We could do that, and we could be part of some group doing some weaving the way we're all trying to be part of, most of us trying to be part of recycling and things like that, the collective activities, stop using fossil fuels, all those things that are recommended to help climate crisis. You can find the list in almost any kind of report. But what changes the world and what changes a life from within is when we pick up the genius thread, when we pick up the thread of our own soul. And I think the answer to how to find that is actually simple in one sense and very complex in another. And that is to say, I'm thinking of an old African proverb, what you love is the cure. The illness is being alive at this time. The cure is connecting to what we love. And so the concise answer in terms of picking up a thread that brings meaning fully alive, that reveals direction and purpose, that can be repeatedly inspirational, not that it doesn't mean we don't suffer and that kind of thing, but that is picking up the thread of what we love, that there's something in us that loves something. And I'll give the example, the only example I really know anything about is I picked up, strangely, it was given to me, and I accidentally, at 13 years old, picked up the thread of mythology. My aunt, on my 13th birthday, she had asked me what I was interested in. I said history. She went to a bookstore, mistakenly got a book. I opened the cover, and she said, oh, it's the wrong book, and I'm looking at this flying horse with a guy in the back shooting an arrow. I'm saying, no, I want the book. She's pulling it and saying it's the wrong book, and I'm saying, I want it. And I take the rest of the paper off. It says mythology. 13 years old, boom, right there. Mistake, but not a mistake. A gift that wasn't intended. A gift that I had to really claim and hold on to, and I had to keep refining it at different times in my life. And I'm very fortunate that way, that I have some sense of that thread. So what I want to say is there's a thread to something that our soul loves and wants to be connected to. And for some people, it has to do directly with the earth. They understand soil. They understand the roots of plants. With other people, it goes to other parts of nature. For others, it goes to parts of culture. There are people that are literally called to work with the dying and to help reimagine how people pass over at the end of life and how funerals are done properly. And all of these things that we're called to are unique and profound. They all involve genius and creativity and imagination. And most people have contact with it at some point in their life, and then it got covered over. And so the only shortcut I know is to reach for what you love, because there's something in us that already loves and knows something about the road we came here to live on. If that's not the case, then it is mostly chaos, and good luck to everybody. One of the challenges of parenting and teaching for me is getting young people to embrace time-honored values. I'm not sure what values I can point to during blind transition out of the current systems. Can you add in the other values to what you've already said? It's too dark for me to see what would be helpful. Honesty, authenticity, community, what else? Well, beauty, love I just mentioned, the ecstatic. The antidote to despair is not simply stability, it's the ecstatic. The antidote to sorrow is its companion joy. I mean, we have to, if we're going to get through this, we have to find the beauty and the joy of life again, and we have to find it in the midst of the darkness. That's what happened in that story when the people went out. And so, but I'm a little troubled by this question. Getting young people to embrace time-honored values. Of the things you mentioned, what I would connect to, first of all, is authenticity. I've done a lot of work with young people. I'm not saying I know everything about it. But young people in the modern world, as they should be, have a heightened sensitivity to the inauthentic. Because most of what's presented to young people is inauthentic. And what makes a person find values in themselves, they don't need it from outside. The values of humanity reside in the depths of everyone's soul. Each young person, especially the ones that are getting in trouble, are trying to trigger that into consciousness. There's something inside that causes young people to go against the grain or to get in trouble so that they could shed the adaptability that they took on in order to survive growing up. And so if what's going on here is in terms of parenting, teaching, which I also think involves mentoring, the key is authenticity. If a person wants to help younger people or anybody, I think the first move is to be authentic, to act from the depths of oneself. That is the greatest lesson that can be offered to children or young people or almost anyone. It's a Greek word, by the way, authenticity, authentikos. Ortho is the root from which we get author. So to be authentic is to be an author, to be making something, which goes back to the idea of the archetype of creation that we're supposed to connect to now. And the second part of the word, entikos, means essence. So to be authentic is to be present in one's essence, but also make something from one's essence. And so when I work with young people, two things are always uppermost to me. One is, I know that most of them don't know that they have genius inside themselves. Most of them don't know they have beauty inside themselves. Most don't know that a dream is trying to awaken in them and that purpose already resides in their self. So I try to mention that to them. I use stories to do it. But if I have to, and if it's crucial circumstances, I will say directly, did you know that you're a genius? Do you know that you have genius? Or I will watch them carefully until I see a demonstration of their genius, and then I will bring that to them and say, I saw that come out of you. So that's one thing. Helping them, or even in general, to say to young people, you don't have to make something out of yourself, you are something. That's what no one told me when I was growing up, and most adults that I know didn't hear that. Everyone has a unique soul and a unique essence, and that is our best chance at having a meaningful life. Maybe it's our only chance. And then the other thing is to be authentic with them. Have whatever's going on become as deep and authentic as possible, because young people are watching. I don't care how they're posing or what they're doing that looks distracted or distracting. They're watching. And because I've heard this from young people, when young people see something authentic, they feel something authentic in themselves, and that's what they need more than a system of values. I'm not saying that you suggested that, but some people do. So anyway, authenticity is an essential move for awakening oneself, and it's an essential move in mentoring or teaching. What is the role of ritual and ceremony as we aim to see in new ways? Thank you. Very simply put, and very important. So again, this is just like big, broad strokes looking at this area of the crisis of climate emergency and the role of mythic imagination. So myth, story, imagination, creativity, depth of feeling, authenticity, individuality, individuation, those are all parts of the mythos realm. But also part of it is ritual. And so when I was talking earlier about communitas, I mean ritual. So there's no way that I can see in the near future, other than the weight of more tragedy, that we can get people who don't agree to simply agree. Tragedy will do it over time. Climate crisis will do it over time when it gets to the point where people can't deny it anymore because the water is rising and the heat is intensifying. And then the tragedy of that will drive people together and will melt the things that are ideological differences or the disputes between belief systems. But the other thing that can do it is ritual. And so, huge thing. It's a whole other subject, but it's an important one. So I'll just mention. Ritual is the ancient and could be the immediate way to handle things that don't suffer simple discussion. When something is so profound that it cannot be, analyzed or discussed, or attempting to analyze it doesn't do any good, then it's time for a ritual. And so the third step in the rite of passage or the initiation is the coming together. It's the ritual of reunion. And all of the divisions that are happening now are the symptoms calling out for reunion. And reunion is often made through rituals. And in rituals, you don't have to agree with everybody. You just have to be present with everybody. And so the intersection of climate crisis and mythic imagination can be seen through ritual also. Oh, God. It's a big subject to come to at the end. One of the things that got interrupted for those of us involved with Mosaic and the work we've been doing was to have this large tree planting done as a ritual with prayers and songs and songs to the earth in particular, and done by a whole bunch of people doing it in a ritual manner with a shared understanding of the sacredness of the earth and the deep connection between the roots of trees and the roots of human souls and so on, and then to do it on video and live stream it so other people could see how you could do something that is relatively simple, like planting a tree, and you could make that activity into an individual ritual that is also part of a collective ritual, and that is done with beauty, and it adds beauty to the world, and it is an enactment of the connection between human culture and nature. And we've been trying to plan it twice, and it's been twice now interrupted by the pandemic. So that's one thought about it. But so many things that we're experiencing now are really calling out for ritual. All the funerals that didn't happen really are calling for other versions and other ways of doing funerals. And just to mention that you don't have to do a funeral right after a person dies. Funerals used to happen repeatedly, and so that can happen again. And so I'm sorry just to brush on that at the end, but thank you for that question. Rituals were the ways that human beings most deeply connected to nature by immersing themselves in it. Something like baptism, which wasn't being dunked in the water, it was being held under water until the spirit inside a person came together. these ideas are in the bone memories of humanity, and they can be brought back. And if we're going to see the world with different eyes, it's going to require mythos and stories and imagination, and that's automatically going to lead to ritual. So thank you for that question. So I think we've come near the end. I'm looking over at Corin. He makes me stop. I'm kidding. He really helps everything get going. But again, thank you for coming and trusting this idea and being interested in these two big energies, nature now in its anguish of climate crisis, and mythos, the movement of imagination in the soul that connects the human life to the regenerative energy of the cosmos. And so a couple of poems and a song. This is Antonio Machado, the Spanish poet. It's possible that while we were sleeping, the hand that sows the seeds of the stars started the ancient music going again. And like a note from a great harp, I love that. And like a note from a great harp, the frail wave came to our lips as one or two honest words. It's a great little poem. It's possible that while we were talking, it's possible that while we were arguing, it's possible that while we were lost in our despair, the hand that sows the seeds of the stars started the ancient music. You know, in many cultures, they said, not in the beginning was the word, but in the beginning was the sound. The ancient music started again like a note from a great harp. And the frail wave of that original note comes to our lips as one or two honest words. So there's something to aim for, to be able to stand in the resonance that produces a couple of authentic, honest words. This is Rumi. You say, I'm so small, I can barely be seen in all of this. How can this great capacity of life be inside me? Rumi says, friend, look at your eyes. They're small, yet they see enormous things. Listen, your love of spying far off satisfactions keeps you from tasting the real water of who and where you are now. The real way is who and where you already are inside yourself. What you search for is sleeping in your very being. And that which sleeps and dreams of the sweet water of life is the taste of the divine in you. The true way is who and where you already are, and it's sleeping in your very being. So that's the old way of talking about what's deep inside. And you could say that all the pain and all the obstacles in life are there not to stop us, but to push us down to that place where we feel in touch with what's already there. So, all right, again, thank you for being interested in this. And I guess I want to say, good luck given the conditions of the world, and blessings on your efforts and your longings and your dreams, because they need to be blessed, because we need to hold on to them and live them out, or we are conceding and collapsing in the face of change. So I didn't sing at the beginning like I usually do, because I wanted to sing in particular at the end. And the song that has come to mind is an earth song. And it goes back to the old woman in the cave, and it goes back to the idea about the goddess and the feminine, and it's the kind of generosity and the capacity of the earth. So on one hand, we have to help the earth, and we have to heal the earth. But on the other hand, the earth is still there trying to help and heal us. And this is a Yoruba song. And the words of it mean, Mother Earth, hold us, for this world is hard. Ne, ne, Eyuya Nene Eyuya Ayeyo Ayele Ayeyo Aye Shodu Nene Eyuya Nene Eyuya Ayeyo Ayele Ayeyo Aye Shodu Nene Eyuya Nene Eyuya Ayeyo Ayele Ayeyo Aye Shodu. Mother Earth told us, for this world is hard. Thank you.